Hi everyone, I am honored to introduce our guest speaker for the Infusing Behavioral Science Within Organization session at the Human Advantage Conference. Now, Suzanne, who is the CEO of BVNH Consulting North America, and myself will be speaking with Professor Don Moore and Professor Max Bazerman. Let's start with Don. Don Moore is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and holds the Lauren Tyson Mitchell Chair in Leadership at the HAC School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. His research interests include overconfidence, a very good book that I recommend, which is the topic of this bestseller, Perfectly Confident. His research has appeared in popular press outlets and academic journals, from Psychological Review to Harvard Business Review. He teaches popular classes on managing organization, negotiation, and decision-making. He is only occasionally overconfident.
Thanks, Eric. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. And our second guest is Max Bazerman, who is the Jesse Isidore Strauss Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Max is the author or co-author of 13 books, including Decision Leadership, which has recently been released and co-authored with Don. This book will be at the center of our conversation today. Max's consulting, teaching, and lecturing includes work in 30 countries. So big welcome to both Max and Don. Thank you both for being with us. We're very glad to have you at the Human Advantage Conference.
Thanks for including us.
So we're going to open the very last session of the Human Advantage Conference, which is going to be about infusing behavioral science within organizations. We'd like to speak with you about the critical role of leaders in this objective. In your book, you call leaders decision architects. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, decision architect is a concept introduced by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in their classic book, Nudge, in which they note the important role of decision context. And leaders, as designers of organizational systems and organizational contexts, are often in the role of being decision architect to structure, guide, and inform the decisions of others in their organization. And so our book encourages leaders to think about that role and intentionally plan the systems around decisions to encourage those in their organizations to make better decisions.
And we see the book as a book about leaders. So obviously the word decision is in the title, as is leadership. And we very much use the decision literature, which we love and feel a part of. But our core argument is that leaders need to embrace the fact that the thing that they most commonly lead are the decisions of others, and think about how to create the architecture in their firm that will lead others to make wise and ethical decisions.
It's a great perspective. It's a little bit broader than a lot of people will default to thinking about leadership, right? About only making good decisions themselves and not thinking necessarily about the architecture of the rest of everyone else's decision making. So it's a very interesting take. So you also think of organizations as decision factories. So why do great leaders need to put their energy into designing a great decision factory and not letting their people make decisions by themselves?
Because the behavioral sciences give us so many hints about how we can move people in more productive, wiser, and more ethical directions. So to let everybody make decisions as they see fit, we know that too many are going to rely too much on their intuition when there are deliberative strategies that can lead them to wiser and more ethical decisions. So when leaders default to whatever, they're missing an opportunity to create systematic and predictable improvements.
And one of the key lessons from decision architecture is the notion that there is no neutral architecture, like the or restaurant or the cafeteria that has to decide how to organize the menu or how to organize the cafeteria with options. There every leader in every organization has to make decisions about which decisions or which options will be the defaults, which ones will be featured most prominently. And our book is just an encouragement for leaders to be thoughtful, deliberative, intentional in the ways that they design those systems.
So just building off of what Don just said, we don't think of our book as simply an application of nudge to leadership. We think of a leader as interacting with lots of other humans who they can influence, their employees, but also their customers and their suppliers. And we believe that leaders can help make those individuals more deliberative, more thoughtful, so that the decision factory is operating at a higher level because it's working off of wiser decisions throughout.
So Max, you mentioned intuition as a common trap that people can fall into, and this came up in your book as the siren song of intuition. So what would you say are the main traps that people fall into when it comes to making good decisions? Because it seems like it's a lot more difficult than we might think.
Well, the important trap, the overwhelming trap, is based on encouragement from a number of influential writers. Lots of people trust their intuition too much. And we don't mean to tell you that you have bad intuition. We simply mean to tell you that for important decisions, your more deliberative thought is more likely to lead to a better and more ethical decision. So undoubtedly, anybody listening or watching this interview is going to rely on their intuition most of the time, and by all means go for it. So when you go to a grocery store, use your intuition. It'll take too long to do a cost-benefit analysis on every item that you buy. But when you get to the important stuff, we certainly think it's time to deliberate, and it's a leader's job to create the structures in place so people are more likely to act in a more deliberative manner.
Any other traps that you want to advise people against? We've got a lot of people who would be very interested in your watch-outs.
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, there is obviously an enormous literature in behavioral decision-making documenting the many flaws that intuition is vulnerable to. There are lots of decisions that feel right because they appeal to superficial aspects of representativeness. There are lots of decisions that will be biased in favor of availability just because some risk is salient or memorable because it's occurred in the recent past, and it'll lead us to overestimate its actual risk. That intuition can be biased in these predictable ways, and that being aware of the flaws of intuition can help us override those imperfections and make better deliberative decisions. Yeah, so possibly the most common manifestation of overconfidence is excessive faith in the quality of our own judgment. We are almost invariably too sure that what we believe is right, and everyone can get better at making well-calibrated decisions by being a little bit more skeptical of themselves and being open to the possibility that they could be wrong. Well-calibrated decision-making necessarily remains open to the possibility of error, and wise and courageous leaders will be willing to admit their own imperfections and their vulnerability to error. In the book, we talk about ways that good leaders can accept input, can capitalize on the wisdom of the crowd, can open themselves to being shown wrong when they gather better evidence through experimentation, for instance, and that a good leader will seek the truth above being right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned also the famous confirmation bias, because even if we want to make a decision which is based on fact and figures, we could make a bad decision because of the confirmation bias.
Yeah, it's easy and comforting to affirm what we already believe, but being effective, being in touch with reality, making decisions that work for others, for our customers, for the broader community, involves being open to evidence and updating our beliefs to bring them into closer alignment with reality.
One of my favorite examples is a simulation that many academics teach. It was written by Jack Britton and Sim Sitkin. It's called Carter Racing, and I'm not going to blow any of the punchlines, but the core decision is whether or not to race your race car, despite the fact that there's some concerns about the engine and temperature issues. And I have students who make the decision individually, and then I send them off to make the decision as in a group, and they don't know what the preferences will be of the other members of the group. And one of the points I make in the debriefing is that when the students are done with their individual decision and they're walking away headed toward their group meeting, I ask them to think about, now, when you were headed to the group meeting, what was your goal? Was it to talk to other smart people to make the best decision possible? Or was it to find enough people to be on your side so that your argument would prevail? And despite the fact that the former is obviously what we would want in organizations, the vast majority of people admit that they were pursuing the latter, that they had an initial opinion, and now they were looking for confirmation by enough people so that their side could win the argument. And I think when you think about that in real organizations, what a missed opportunity to not listen to and learn from the minority who might tell us something that we would find wise if we stopped and considered. So I think that this notion of sort of searching for confirming information is just widespread across lots of different contexts. And I think that there's lots of ways in which leaders could intervene and clarify the goal and bust up this search for confirmatory information.
Yeah, it's too often that leaders feel that in order to demonstrate confidence and build faith in their leadership, they should always act as if they're right and try to win others over to their cause, when in fact there is a great benefit to leaders' credibility in showing a willingness to accept inputs, corrective inputs, in order to help them make better decisions.
You make a really good point, Don, about what we think a leader should look like and how that dictates some of our actions. And, you know, a lot of what you're describing is System 1, automatic, fast, intuitive tendencies, and really trying to get people to get into your slower, more reflective System 2. But I'm sure when you talk to leaders about this, you get some pushback along the lines of, I don't have time for that. What do you say to that sort of objection?
Well, consistent with what Max said, there is undeniably a role for System 1 processing. Our goal would not be to insist that everybody always compute a multi-attribute utility matrix and generate a decision tree, computing expected values for every possible decision. Managers make so many decisions that they simply must rely on their intuitions for many of them, especially those everyday decisions that have low stakes. But when the stakes are high, when it really matters, it is worth taking the time to pause, to deliberate, to reflect, to gather more information. And this is not a recommendation for analysis paralysis, for dithering endlessly and delegating to committees that take lots of time gathering more information, because often there is a cost to inaction, and you should only wait and gather more information as long as that delay increases the expected quality of the decision commensurate with the cost of that delay. So wise leaders will make that trade-off effectively. But when the stakes are high, it's really worth it to go through and try to make the most effective decision you can.
Yeah, I would simply say you can't afford not to take enough time to deliberate a bit. And that if you actually think you don't have time to deliberate, you really should get a new job. You shouldn't be a CEO if you don't have time to deliberate, because the shareholders don't want your intuitive decisions misguiding the firm on a regular basis. So I think that leader needs to rethink about how they're using their time and find other opportunities in their schedule. I'm very inspired by a recent book by Linda Babcock and colleagues out of Carnegie Mellon called Just Say No. And they sort of talk about the need. Their example most commonly is female faculty members, but I think it applies to human beings, that a lot of us get sort of overcommitted because we said yes to things that we should have said no to. So I think that executive needs to think about how to clear their slate so that they do have time for the really important stuff. And that's kind of the point of the Babcock et al. Group, to basically think about, you need to think thoughtfully about how to use your time, and that may mean saying no in contexts where you feel like you're not being the good person that you would like to be by always saying yes. But if you always say yes, you don't have time to do any of your work well, and you're not really providing the most value you possibly could.
Absolutely, less is more in that case. So we've talked about what to avoid. So let's go to the flip side. How can great leaders design a successful decision factory? You've alluded to a few techniques, but we'd love to hear more in detail.
Well, one of the things that we've sort of touched on slightly is building systems that encourage others within the organization to make more effective decisions. And one way to do that is by rewarding good decision processes that thoughtfully incorporate the relevant considerations and select the option with the highest expected value. Some organizations, like Amazon, try to be explicit about this process and encourage the champions of important organizational initiatives to introduce those initiatives with memos that actually go through and delineate the key considerations, and then open that analysis for discussion at a meeting with a whole bunch of people, some of whom may disagree. And the meeting's goal is to come to the wisest possible decision, considering all the relevant possibilities and all the relevant information. Other recommendations that we make in our book include gathering information from others, capitalizing on the wisdom of the crowd when possible, and gathering information from the world by running experiments that test some of your basic assumptions. Because, again, it is easy for us to be too sure of ourselves, and allowing the real world to disconfirm our erroneous assumptions is enormously helpful for making better decisions. Max, what would you add?
I was sitting here listening to you provide a couple of options, Don, because my head was swimming in the fact the book is just filled with so many different levers that the leader has available. Earlier you were talking to Don about overconfidence, and too many leaders reward people for being overconfident. And I think that leaders can make it less attractive to overselling your ideas internally kind of on a regular basis. One of my favorite levers comes from research that I've been involved in, Don's been involved in, but lots of others as well, showing that comparative or joint decision making is more powerful, more effective, and more ethical than considering one option at a time. So in one experiment that I did with Eris Bonet, who I know is also part of your program, Eris, Alexandra Van Geen, and I show that if we could take a context in which we know that there's bias, that people tend to be sexist in preferring men over women for math-related tasks, we find that while that's true, when people are evaluated individually, when people compare multiple different candidates, we find that sexism largely disappears and people use job-relevant criteria. And as a broad toll, I would say comparative decision-making leads to more deliberation. When we evaluate one product, one person at a time, our intuition runs wild, and our intuition holds stronger biases in our more deliberative thought. So anything we could do that switches people into a more deliberative mode is likely to lead to better and more ethical decisions, whether it's kind of hiring people or just counting to 10 before you hit return on when you're angry about an email. Deliberation simply helps and leads you on a more useful path.
I'll just add one more organizational practice that we recommend in the book. And this one is inspired by my work with Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers on the Good Judgment Forecasting Project, where we tried to help people get better at making probabilistic estimates of uncertain future outcomes. That is, keep track and keep score. When you're making expected value calculations that include probabilities and predictions of future outcomes, your organization will runs a risk of promoting overconfident blowhards who act like they know what's going to happen, but who are actually wrong pretty frequently. If you don't follow up and point out when people are wrong, you can help people get better calibrated by making it clear, we're going to follow up later. And when we know the outcome of this prediction, we'll remind everybody what your predictions were and talk about how we can collectively get better at making these sorts of predictions.
Very interesting. So all of these are really good approaches, but obviously perhaps easier said than done in real life. So do you have any examples of concrete actions that illustrate how to be successful at implementing these levers and these processes and these approaches?
Max, should we talk about some of the leaders we profile?
Sure, go for it.
In the book? Okay, so one of the people, the unconventional leaders we profile in the book is a woman named Jessie Wisdom. She was in people operations at Google and helped Googlers make decisions more compatible with their own interests and the interests of the organization by consuming less of the fattening sweets that Google provides its employees in unlimited quantities, putting desserts in opaque containers and moving them to the back of the cafeteria. She also helped design systems to help Googlers make better decisions about their retirement savings and a number of other things, and took this expertise with her to Humu, a human resources consulting firm that she founded with Laszlo Bock, who also was in people operations at Google. And they provide these services now to lots of companies that are interested in using nudges and principles of behavioral decision making to help people make better decisions, more ethical decisions, decisions that are more consistent with the interests of the organization and the larger communities that they're working in.
So I was very interested to read that you recommend to reward good decision processes rather than results. I think it is a kind of revolution.
Yeah, lots of organizations boast about being results-oriented, but if that means rewarding the lucky, whose risky decisions happen to turn out, and punishing the unlucky, even when their wise decisions just happen to get unlucky, well, that's a lousy scheme for guiding employees to make good decisions with high expected value, even when they come with risks. What you'll get there is a bunch of risk-averse decisions with low expected values. So the challenge there is to avoid the hindsight bias and the temptation that all of us have to observe the result and infer from the result what the quality of the decision ex ante must have been. But that's a mistake. Here we draw inspiration from Annie Duke and the poker player's caution against resulting. A bad bet can still win if you get lucky on the cards, whereas a good bet, a wise bet, can still lose if you get unlucky on the cards. as a poker player, you can't control the cards. You can just make the best bet possible given the limited information you have available to you. Those poker players who do will win in the long term, even though sometimes they'll get unlucky.
Absolutely. So, as a research company at BVA Group, we're very interested that you mentioned the key role of experimentation, which has come up a little bit in this conversation. Could you tell us more about why you think this is so important and how a leader can create both the culture and the capacity for experimentation in their organization?
So I think that this builds on the humility that Don talked about earlier. If you admit that you don't know the answer, then you're one step forward in terms of realizing that you need to collect better evidence. And there's lots of ways we can collect better evidence. We've talked about some of those, including crowdsourcing. And if you can't get a big crowd, turns out small crowds can do a lot of good. And we cite the work of Larrick and Sol on the wisdom of small crowds. So there's lots of different ways that we could get evidence. But one that we're particularly fond of, and BVA knows this because you interviewed Mike Luca and myself on our book, The Power of Experiments. But in the current book, we talk about the role that leaders play in realizing the need for better evidence. So, in some domains, we see dramatic growth in the use of experimentation. So governments have been enormously influenced by the behavioral insight team, and we now see lots of governments using experiments to find out what works. And the behavioral insight team has run over 1,000 experiments, I think the majority of which have been with government agencies. So experiments have become cool in that domain. And similarly, we see in the tech sector where experiments can easily be run by changing the platform and running multiple versions, we see enormous use of experiments. I understand from Mike Luca that Google runs over 10,000 different experiments per year. So even if that number is wrong, they're running a lot of experiments, and this has become normalized in the tech sector. We see slower movement, but increasing movement in what we might think about traditional organization, and we see slower movement in terms of sort of experiments that involve actual human interaction. So one domain that I've been involved in has to do with negotiating insurance claims. And I worked with a very large insurer with Danny Kahneman on a project where the organization was very, very open to our ideas about how to restructure and train claims adjusters to more effectively negotiate claims and hopefully bring down the legal costs associated with negotiating claims. But I remember multiple conversations where we tried to convince the leadership that we actually are confident about our ideas, but before we implement worldwide, we would run an experiment on a smaller population to refine and improve the ideas and make sure that it works. And we were unsuccessful, and that's a disappointment to me. It's very tough to get leaders to run experiments on actual human behavior. But when this leadership team was going to roll this out in over 100 countries involving thousands of claims adjusters, I think that there was enormous wisdom in first starting with thousands of claims rather than rolling it out to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of claims. So I think that we need humility. And we need to figure out how to reduce the cost of experimentation to make the use of experiments move beyond the tech and government parts of our environment.
It is ironic that it is often easier to persuade a company's leadership to implement one arbitrary selected condition from what deserves to be an experiment with multiple conditions comparing different approaches.
Goes back to our earlier point about, it can be hard to convince people in leadership to slow down a little bit, but you really can't afford not to.
Good idea.
Thank you so much, Don and Max, for sharing all these great insights. So maybe one last question before we start our roundtable. Except reading your book, which is the advice I give to all our audience, what would be the one piece of advice you would give to leaders who would like to start applying behavioral science?
Well, they should worry not just about their own decisions, but the decisions of all the people they lead. So they shouldn't just read our book, but they should buy it for all the people who work for them.
In our book, we come out pretty strongly in favor of maximizing the aggregate welfare. The hallmark of a good leadership decision is a decision that maximizes the benefit for the many constituents, the different parts of the organization and the stakeholders outside the organization. Leadership is, in that sense, an inherently collective enterprise. And so we come out pretty strongly in favor of maximizing the expected value of those decisions for the many constituents that those decisions can affect.
Thanks a lot to both of you. I was sure it would be a wonderful conversation, and it was. I'm sure it will be a wonderful intro to our infusing behavioral science within organization session. So really, I am grateful to you. It was wonderful.